My name's Lachlan.
Hey, Lachlan.
I've built quite a relationship with God over the course of my life, but I have a lot of questions about the Trinity. Sorry, it's not about the veracity of the Bible. I know that's your whole talk tonight, but basically, I don't understand the distinction between God the Father and God the Son. I pray to God the Father, and I don't know why, like a lot of the people I know in my life, they pray to Jesus. And I've built quite the relationship praying to God and trying to get to know him. And I don't really know why I need Jesus.
Yeah. Well, thank you, first and foremost, for your transparency to ask that question. I think there's a level that we can all relate to what you just said, in the sense that there are aspects of who God is that we will never truly grasp. And thank goodness that our salvation is not based on a theological exam. Because I think I myself would personally fail. I'm not going to speak for everybody in the room.
I can vouch for that.
Okay, thank you. It's an Ipswich thing. I don't want to... But I think, what we see within Scripture, and we have to be honest with what we see within Scripture, is that what we see described is that God is complex within his unity.
Yeah.
And that continually we have statements that are repeated. Statements like Deuteronomy 34:6, which is sometimes referred to as the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one God. And this is a statement that has been repeated since the time of Moses to modern Orthodox Jews today, every morning and every evening. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one God. And yet, we have these examples of God describing himself in a complex nature, that he's ruling and reigning in heaven, but he is in a physical presence on the top of the Ark of the Covenant, on the mercy seat. And we have stories like we see in Genesis chapter 18, where two angels and one individual identified as Yahweh, as the God of the Bible, shows up to Abraham's tent, and they dialogue with Abraham about what's going to transpire at Sodom and Gomorrah. The two angels leave to go deal with Abraham's relatives in Sodom and Gomorrah, and then the extended conversation between Abraham and God eventually has God leaving in some sort of physical form. And then it has this very interesting passage in Genesis 19 where it says, and then Yahweh in heaven rained fire and brimstone from Yahweh on earth. What? There's only one God. There isn't two Yahwehs. So what's going on? I would posit that if God was fully comprehensible, if you could understand all the intricacies of who God is within both his being and his character, it's probably a God that you made up. That as we are complex, God is even infinitely more complex. And there is an aspect that theologians talk about in what's sometimes described as understanding and comprehending, in that I can understand when the Bible talks about eternity as a long period of time, in my kind of finite thinking. But what does time without end mean? I can't comprehend that. I can't wrap my head around that. But what do we see communicated to about who God is that the Father is described as Yahweh God in his honors, attributes, his names, his deeds, and he's given the seat of the Almighty. Jesus is described and given the honors, the attributes, the names, the deeds, and the seat of the Almighty. And the Spirit is given the honors, the attributes, the names, the deeds, and the seat of the Almighty. It spells out HANDS, by the way. It's an acronym. I did that so you could remember it. I didn't come up with that. Two brilliant scholars named Rob Bowman and Ed Komachowski came up with that in a book that you're all going to read after this called The Incarnate Christ and His Critics. But what we get from that is that we see this happening, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit all being described with those qualities of Yahweh. And so we say, okay, there's one being of God. Being describes what you are. But there are three persons. Person describes who you are. This chair has being, right? It exists. I didn't walk over and say, excuse me, Mr. Chair, can I sit on you? Do you mind that? Right? Because it doesn't have personhood. But it has being. Don't believe me, I'll throw it at you and you can find out. And
Act
yet,
preacher.
Yeah, right. And yet, Dan is a being. He's a human being. but he is also a person.
Amen.
He's Dan Patterson, right? He is one in being and one in person. And as the creator of us as human beings who inhabit a personhood, I would posit that even in our finite understanding that we cannot truly comprehend, that the God of creation, I think it would merit that he is more complex than that. And even in all the things that we cannot and do not understand about the God of the Bible, we still can come to this text and say, what I see here is describing something that maybe I don't fully understand, but that I can submit myself to humbly in saying, I don't understand all the details, but what I do see is something that is wonderful and that is beautiful, and that the Father sends the Son, and the Son goes willingly of his own accord, and he dies in our place through the power of the Spirit in order to give us life. That the message of the gospel and salvation is inherently Trinitarian. It is the three operating co-equally and co-eternally in a set of living, loving relationships. And even if I don't understand how that parses out in every way, I can submit myself to it because I believe that this is true.
That's great. Thank you.
Hi guys, my name's Elijah. Thanks for being here tonight. Reading the Bible for the first time, it's natural to assume that Paul's epistles were written after the Gospels and the eyewitness accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. However, most scholars now agree that the Gospels were all written. Gospels were written many years after Paul's letters. Given this, how can we be sure that Paul's theology and interpretation of Jesus did not influence the stories of Jesus that were passed down orally over many decades?
Yeah, great question. So I think we can unanimously say that that is a reality. Paul is our earliest source material for who Jesus is in terms of descriptions of this character, this itinerant rabbi named Jesus of Nazareth. And it's then after that we see the oral tradition, what's sometimes referred to as the kerygma, and that's just a word that means the oral tradition that's floating around within the early Jesus community that is eventually written down by these four individuals, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What I think we can say is that, Paul's letters range in their dates, and what we see within those is testified to in both the angles of what Paul is doing and how he's communicating to these early Christian communities that then mirror the person and identity of who Jesus is. I don't think they're in competition with one another. I think they fill in the beauty of the complex picture of what we see within who Jesus is. Now, some people argue that, why did it take them so long to write these things down? And we ask that today because we live in a hyper-literate culture. But the ancient world was not as literate as we are today. And in fact, memorization and rearticulation of stories and facts was the norm back then. Writing was incredibly expensive and incredibly arduous and took a lot of time, and very few people could do it really well. When Luke says that he's undertaking to write an orderly account, I think what he's saying there is that some people have attempted and they've written a not very orderly account in the past. And interestingly enough, if we assume that something like the Gospel of Mark comes before Luke, if you learn Greek and you start with something that's very simple like the Gospel of Mark, you find that it is not very orderly in the way that it's written.
Lots of and-thens.
Lots of and-thens. Yeah. It's like my son who tells me stories. Daddy, and then I went to the park, and then I came home, and then I ate a pizza, and then and then. This is called parataxis. And so we see that. And I think Luke, who is a doctor, who is educated, who has a literacy level within the language of Greek, looks at Mark and he says, okay, that's great. That story is true. It's not written as well as I think I could do. And that's not to say that he's trying to improve upon the message. He's writing down for this individual Theophilus an orderly account so that he can communicate from the eyewitness testimony, maybe things that are not included in some of these previous Gospels. So I don't think, although none of these documents are given dates internally, that is a problem with their ability to communicate early eyewitness testimony. And we can source that from things like we talked about tonight, from the location information that's located within the actual documents, from unnecessary details, from undesigned coincidences. All of these scream early eyewitness testimony. And then Paul, although he's writing before the Gospels in some instances, he is likewise giving the level of credibility to what we see within the time frame and descriptions of the biographical accounts of Jesus.
That's great.